years I spent in vanity and pride, caring not my Lord was crucified, knowing not it was for me he died on Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. By God's word at last my sin I learned, then I trembled at the law I'd spurn, till my guilty soul imploring turned to Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. Now I give to Jesus everything. Now I gladly own him as my King. Now my raptured soul can only sing of Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. Oh, the love that drew salvation's plan. Oh, the grace that brought it down to man. Oh, the mighty gulf that God did span at Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary.
There's so much that I want to say that ranges over so many passages of Scripture. We want to try to form an impression of the grandeur of Solomon's kingdom and the way that things went with him. You know, thanks largely to his father David, because as I've said before, the greatness of Solomon was very largely inherited. Thanks to his father David and his military exploits and to the marriage that he'd contracted with the princess of Egypt, Solomon's kingdom extended from the borders of Egypt right to the river Euphrates, that's right to the east. You find this in chapter 4 and verse 21. I'm going to read some verses like this today. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Now this refers to the fact that nations like Edom, which was just below the Dead Sea and near the Red Sea itself, Edom and Moab and the Aramean kingdoms, the Syrian kingdoms, were all tributaries to Solomon. They all had to pay their annual levy, their annual tribute to him. And according to another passage in Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 8, he even built a city called Tadmor, which is sometimes called Palmyra, 140 miles northeast of Damascus, the capital of Syria. And it was a kind of commercial outpost where he traded with other nations. And besides this, he made use in the beginning of the ships of Hiram, king of Tyre. Because you remember the Phoenicians who lived along the coastline there were the famous sailors. They were great navigators, great seamen. And he made use of those ships, first of all, to embark on overseas trade. Chapter 10 and verse 22 tells us about this. And we find that later on Solomon built his own ships. But let's look at chapter 10, verse 22. For the king had a fleet of ships of Tarshish at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years the fleet of ships of Tarshish used to come bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes and peacocks. Now if you don't like the peacocks, another translation has baboons. There's a bit of a dispute as to whether it means peacocks or baboons. And these would undoubtedly be something of novelties in those days. Now, besides all this, he controlled the border country of Moab and Edom and Syria. And this meant that he monopolized the caravan routes. Through the whole of the Fertile Crescent, he monopolized the caravan routes, the trade routes, to his own advantage. And as far as Egypt was concerned, look at chapter 10, verse 28. And Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Kue. And the king's traders received them from Kue at a price. A chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And so, through the king's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. In other words, he was a horse dealer. He was a horse trader. He imported horses from Egypt, and he sold them to other nations. Now, the reason for the importation is very simple. In Deuteronomy 17 and verse 16, there's a verse that says that the king should not multiply horses to himself. In other words, it was forbidden to the Jews to breed horses. Very largely because the horse always symbolized the warlike animal. It was a warlike animal, an animal used for war in those days, not for domestic purposes. And so, Solomon bought the horses, and he resold them at a profit. Now, when you know about this horse trading, you can also understand chapter 4 and verse 28. Look at that for just a minute. Chapter 4 and verse 28. Have we got the right verse there? Not 28. Not 28. It's 20. Chapter 4, verse 26. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots, and 12,000 horsemen. 40,000 stalls, in other words, stables. Now, this is a fact. Because he had so many horses, you can understand that in the fortified cities that he had dotted up and down his kingdom, he had places for stabling the horses. Excavations as late as the 1930s, 1934, at Megiddo, which turns out to be a fortified city, revealed stabling facilities for 450 horses in that city. And since he had other fortified cities at Hazor and Eglon and Gezer and Tanakh and other places besides, and incidentally there too excavations have revealed the stables, you can understand that these figures aren't exaggerated as scholars have sometimes thought. And by the way, although these form part of Solomon's military preparedness, Solomon doesn't go down in history as a warrior. You don't find any word of the battles that he fought, because all that was done before him by his father, by his father David. And Solomon's standing army was simply part of his readiness, just in case anything happened. Now let's think a bit more about these trading activities of Solomon. The port from which his ship set sail was Ezion Gezer on the shores of the Red Sea. It was the place where the ships came in once every 3 years, bringing all these goodies from foreign countries, bringing all the novelties that people in Palestine were not accustomed to. And remember, as I've already said, although later on he built his own ships, he hired the Phoenician sailors to crew them for him for the very simple reason that the Israelites were never seamen. They were farmers, they were shepherds, and the sea was a great mystery to the Israelites, and consequently, Solomon depended very largely on the cooperation of Hiram, who provided the crews for his ships to make these trading voyages. And I suppose, too, you could almost say that Solomon very largely depended on Hiram in other ways. For example, his building project. You know, the Phoenicians were way ahead of the Jews, the Israelites, in many, many ways. They were not only skilled potters, bringing all the arts of the Mediterranean islands with them, but they were also skilled builders and stonemasons. They could handle timber. They could use all kinds of materials, and therefore Solomon depended on Hiram and his skilled craftsmen for so much in building up his own nation. And furthermore, that port of Ezion Geber was also very important because that's where the copper smelting and the iron foundries were. Ever since ever since Egyptian times, the Egyptians had copper mining going on in the Sinai Peninsula, even in the days of Moses. And now that Solomon has taken over that territory to the south, he's taken hold of this very rich mineral area. And that's where he had a copper smelting plant and iron foundries. And really, those places were strategically located on the shores of the Red Sea because there came a huge wind rushing down the valley to serve, almost like turn them into blast furnaces. They used the principle in those days of the blast furnace was used by Solomon to produce copper. And that wind blew down and fired the furnaces and, of course, went out to sea. So, you see Solomon, first of all, controlling the trade routes to his own advantage. You see him developing trade with neighboring countries. You see him using a fleet of ships for overseas trade. You see him producing valuable copper and iron at a time when they were very, very precious metals. And you see him again, fifthly, receiving tribute from all these other nations round about that he'd conquered or over which he was overlord. Look at chapter 10, verse 25. Chapter 10, verse 25. Every one of them, it says, well, let's begin at 23. Thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And the whole earth, that's a bit exaggerated, of course, but you understand it means the whole of the area, sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses and mules, so much year by year. That's the key phrase, year by year. This was the annual tribute paid by his tributaries. Now, as if that weren't enough, the people who came to visit him brought him presents too. Look at chapter 10, verse 10. The Queen of Sheba has been to visit him. And then she gave the king 120 talents of gold and a very great quantity of spices and precious stones. Never again came such an abundance of spices as these which the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Now, 120 talents of gold. Now, do you know what a talent weighed? Any idea? Anybody any idea what a talent weighed? Now, we're talking about a gold talent. Because a talent is not a coin of a certain size. No, we often confuse it with the New Testament. One man got 5 talents, and another 3 talents, and another 2 talents. And very often in our minds, we imagine that coins were given out to these men with which to do business. But a talent is a weight. A talent of silver weighed 117 pounds. A talent of gold weighed 130 pounds. Now, she gave him 120 talents. Well, that amounts to 6.5 tons of gold. Yeah, fantastic. Yes, it's right. But if you look at chapter 10, verse 14, now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, besides that which came from the traders and from the traffics of the merchants and from all the kings of Arabia and from the governors of the land. Now, the present value of gold is 90 pounds an ounce. 90 pounds an ounce. I tried to work it out on my calculator, but my calculator wouldn't take the figures. But if you reckon 2,240 pounds to the ton, and 16 ounces to the pound, and 90 pounds to the ounce, that comes to the staggering figure, and I eventually did work it out, 125,798,400 pounds at present day value. And that's just the gold that came in 1 year, apart from all these other things. Now, when it says that Solomon was the richest man that ever lived, even the Arab sheiks today would have to go a long way to match that, even with all their oil revenues. And of course, this is not the end of it. It says, besides that which came in from the traders and the traffic of the merchants, and from the kings of Arabia, and from the governors of the land. In other words, beside all the business and all the levies that were laid on the tributary states, this is extra. Now, when you know that, you come to verses 16 to 21, I think will do the trick for us, of that same passage. You can understand these verses. King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each shield. And he made 300 shekels of beaten gold. 3 minas of gold went into each shield. And the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. And the king also made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with the finest gold. The throne had 6 steps, and at the back of the throne was a calf's head. And on each side of the seat were armrests, and 2 lions standing beside the armrests, while 12 lions stood there, one on each end of a step on the 6 steps. The like of it was never made in any kingdom. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. It was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. Now, you can see that it was really a grand kingdom. And then there are all his building projects too. As I said, the Israelites weren't noted for building, and consequently they used the Phoenicians, who were skilled builders. And by the way, excavations were carried out some years ago at the temple in Jerusalem. You know, the present temple is not Solomon's temple. The present temple, well, the temple was destroyed 2 or 3 times and rebuilt 2 or 3 times. But they've actually got down to a quarry underneath the temple, and they've actually discovered there in caves places where the stone had been quarried out of the face, fairly soft, and which it gradually hardened as it dried out. And they've discovered Phoenician stonemasons' marks on stones left in those caverns, left in the quarries underneath. So they know very well that they've got down to Solomon's foundation, and the Bible is proved true again when it speaks of Phoenician builders being used in Solomon's building projects. Well, that's what Solomon did. He employed these men who were stonemasons and carpenters. And the first project that he planned was, of course, the project that David had in mind, the building of a temple for God. And then that was to be followed by a palace for himself. Now, in this section, which we're not going to read concerning the temple, we find that he assigned 70,000 men simply to carry the loads, simply to be burden bearers, and 80,000 men to work in the quarries and in the forests of Lebanon, with 3,600 overseers. Now, he needed help with this job. He provided the labor, but Hiram provided the craftsmen. And we're told that he came to an understanding with Hiram. He said, now, if you will give me craftsmen to do this job, I'll provide you with wheat and barley and wine and oil. And that's exactly the agreement that was made. We find that Hiram agreed with this. He found it a very good bargain, because, you know, whilst the Phoenicians had plenty of timber, plenty of cedar at Lebanon, they didn't have any corn. They didn't have any harvest of that kind. They didn't grow grapes. They didn't grow olives to provide oil. And so Hiram provided the craftsmen, the supervisors, and the timber, whilst Solomon kept him going with the necessities by way of food, corn and oil and wine. And this seemed to be a good deal. But unfortunately, this friendship that he had with Solomon turned rather sour. Will you turn to 1 Kings chapter 9 and look at verses 10 to 14 with me? 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 10 to 14. Have I got the right one here? Yes. At the end of 20 years, in which Solomon built the 2 houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house, and Hiram king of Tyre had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress timber and gold, as much as he desired, King Solomon gave to Hiram 20 cities of the land of Galilee. Now, putting it quite bluntly, what happened? It means that Solomon got behind with his payment. Solomon couldn't afford to pay corn and oil and wine. So he gave Hiram 10 cities in Galilee. Now look what happens. Hiram came from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him. They did not please him. Therefore he said, what kind of cities are these which you have given me, my brother? So they are called the land of Kabul to this day. Now, the word cabal means unpleasing, or more literally, dirty. So, Solomon tried to pay off his debt by giving cities, and Hiram simply didn't appreciate it. And the friendship went sour from that time. In actual fact, Solomon virtually bankrupted the kingdom. And it's not altogether surprising when you understand the grand manner in which he lived. If you look at chapter 4, you'll see that he made some internal changes. Look at the beginning of chapter 4. King Solomon was king over all Israel, and these were his high officials. Then in verse 7 of that chapter, Solomon had 12 officers over all Israel who provided food for the king and his household. Each man had to make provision for 1 month in the year. Now, up to this time, although the 12 tribes had acknowledged his father David as king, it had been something of a loose confederacy, because these 12 tribes were tribes of independent people. And the idea of a king over all of them, a true monarchy, was something new to them, and something not altogether acceptable. And even though David had been king, and they'd acknowledged him as king, they had maintained a great degree of independence. Now Solomon determines to weld the 12 tribes into a real kingdom, and to diminish the tribal independence. And so he puts the 12 tribes into 12 districts, and appoints a governor over each district. In other words, he was following the practice of Egypt, because Egypt was divided into districts in the same way, with a local governor. In other words, he took away the tribal distinctiveness, and made them rather inconspicuous and faceless as districts. And the governor of each district was responsible for 1 month of the year, providing the royal palace with its food and provisions. Interesting to notice the name of the governor of the first district. If you've got the Revised Standard Version, look at it in verse 8. Now, if you want to know where General Lew Wallace got the name of his book, Ben-Hur, that's it. It doesn't come out as Ben-Hur in the Authorized Version, it's son of Hur. But Ben means son of. And this is where the name Ben-Hur comes from this verse. All right? Now, it would seem that at the beginning of this glorious reign, the people, were reasonably happy. Chapter 4, verse 20 says, they ate and drank and were happy. And they lived in peace, and that was a new thing. Judah and Israel dwelt in safety from Dan to Beersheba, that's from the north to the south. Every man under his vine and under his fig tree all the days of Solomon. Now, I'm not sure how literally the historian wants us to take this little phrase, all the days of Solomon, because later on, the people began to feel the weight of Solomon's extravagance and excess. To begin with, in order to push through these building projects, he raised a levy of forced labor. The people that I talked about, 150,000 bondmen, slaves in other words. He discovered that there were 153,000 foreigners dwelling in his land. This was the result of David's census. And so he took 150,000 of them and divided them into the 80,000 and the 70,000 and put them into forced labor. There's even a suggestion later on that his own people became servants in this particular way. And to begin with, he didn't do it on his own people. The Jews were not made, or the Israelites as they were not made themselves bondservants at the time. Chapter 9, verse 22 tells you that. It was only the captives at the time. Let me look at that verse with you. Chapter 9 and verse 22. But of the people of Israel, Solomon made no slaves. They were the soldiers. They were his officials, his commanders, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen. But later on, of course, this changed. And the people themselves began to feel the weight of servitude that Solomon imposed upon them. And once again, he's following the example of Egypt. What happened to Israel in Egypt? They were used to build the monuments. They were used to build the great cities, Ramesses and Pithom. And he's doing the same thing with them. 150,000. And he puts them on a kind of rota system. 1 month in the quarries and in the forest, and 2 months at home, 10,000 at a time. Now this became hard on the people. So that by the time that Solomon was ready to die, they were ready to rebel. In fact, they did rebel, but not during his lifetime. Somehow the kingdom held together while he was alive. But you can see the writing on the wall, and his son Rehoboam is going to feel it. After all, I suppose you can say that like his father David, towards the end of his life, Solomon's life was a tragedy. His wives and concubines, there were 1,000 of them, we're told, influenced the introduction of idolatry into the land. And look at 1 Kings 11 and verses 5 to 8. And this, I think, is tragic. 1 Kings 11, verses 5 to 8. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, or Moloch, that is, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. In other words, he tried to effect a compromise. He would say that he was serving God, but at the same time he served these other idols as well. And that was the crowning insult. Not only that he served the gods of the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Sidonians, but he even had the audacity, the nerve, to erect a shrine to Moloch on what was the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. Now the god Moloch was a great brazen idol, hollow inside, with arms outstretched, and they used to put fire, set a fire going inside the idol so that the brass became red hot, and they used to put little babies onto the arms of the idol. Or even adult sacrifices. And they used to beat drums to drown the screams of the victims. And there's a valley called Topheth in the Bible, and that's where this kind of worship often took place, in Topheth. The word Topheth is a drum. It's the word for drum, Topheth, and it literally refers to the beating of the drum to drown the screams. Can you imagine Solomon doing this? Can you imagine him tolerating it? But that's exactly what he did. And for this reason, God allowed an enemy to arise. When David had captured Edom, he'd destroyed practically the whole of the royal family, but somebody escaped. Hadad escaped and went to find refuge eventually in Egypt. And Hadad the Edomite was astute enough to recognize the signs of weakness in Solomon's kingdom at this time. And so with the help of Egypt, he raised the rebellion against Solomon to try to get independence for Edom. And once that was done, in Damascus too, to the north, in Syria, there was another rebellion. And another independent ruler set himself up, and Solomon could do little about it. We're told that he was a thorn in the side of Solomon all the time that Solomon remained alive. And even worse than that, in his own kingdom, Jeroboam, who'd been in charge of the forced labor from Judah, began to show signs of restlessness. He saw the way that things were going. He saw that Solomon was displeasing his people. He saw the rebellion arising. And he was helped to rebel against Solomon because the prophet Ahijah came to him one day in a field. Ahijah had put on a new garment. And he came to the general, Jeroboam, and Ahijah took off his own garment and he tore it into 12 pieces. And he handed 10 pieces to Jeroboam. And he said, in this way, God will rend the kingdom of Solomon, and he has given 10 pieces to you. Now that was all the incentive that Jeroboam needed, to be told that God was going to give him 10 of the tribes. And of course, as soon as Solomon heard about this, then Jeroboam's life was in danger, and Jeroboam fled to Egypt, and remained in Egypt, out of the reach of Solomon, until Solomon died. And maybe you're thinking, well, surely Egypt was an ally of Solomon. Surely Solomon has married a princess of Egypt. Surely he's made a treaty with Egypt. That's absolutely true. But remember, I told you that was the 21st dynasty. And that was the time when Egypt was at its very weakest, when the priest won the throne. But when the 21st dynasty ended, in the 900s BC, a new king came to the throne, actually a man of Libyan descent, and he began to think in terms of once again expanding the kingdom of Egypt and bringing back some of its former greatness. His name was Shishonk. He's called Shishonk in Egyptian records. The Bible calls him Shishak the First, and you can read about him in chapter 11. Look at chapter 11 and verse 29. At that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him on the road. This is that the one I'm looking at? Chapter 11, is that the one I'm looking for? Where it speaks of Shishak the First. Yes, about the tearing of the garment, but the name of the king of Egypt is it's chapter verse 40 rather. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, who was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So this is a new king. The bad days, the days of the decline of Egypt are over, and Shishak wants to expand the kingdom. Now, it is in the interests of Shishak, king of Egypt, to renounce the treaty with Solomon, and a weakened Solomon and a weakened Israel will serve his purposes. So he's quite willing to give support to anybody who will rise up in rebellion against Solomon. Well, and I'm going to conclude in just a couple of minutes. When you bear this in mind, and you consider the luxurious living and the religious infidelity of Solomon, well, this proved too much for the people. And when he died, the prophecy made by Ahijah came true, and the kingdom was divided. I've not said anything about the temple. I will say a few words, not too much, a few words about it, because the details are given in chapters 6 and 7, and you really have to study the details to see what a marvelous temple it must have been. It wasn't particularly large, because it wasn't designed for public worship. It wasn't meant to be a meeting place, that first temple of Solomon. It was designed as a shrine for God. It was supposed to represent the dwelling place of God, like the tabernacle itself. In the class, we've been talking about the tabernacle, and we've seen that in actual fact it was only the holy place and the Holy of Holies together were only 45 feet long and 15 feet wide, and the actual Holy of Holies in the tabernacle was only 15 feet by 15 feet by 15 feet. Much smaller than this room we're in today. So the temple was very much like that. It was meant to be a sort of shrine for God, to represent the dwelling place of God on earth. And like the tabernacle, that inner shrine, the Holy of Holies, was entered only by the high priest alone on the Day of Atonement, once every year. And the ordinary priests ministered outside in the holy place. Now the basic material of the temple that Solomon built was white limestone. And the interior walls were clad, first of all, with sandalwood, or cedarwood, I should say. Cedarwood. And then on top of the cedarwood was a layer of gold. The whole interior was gold covered. So you can understand how much he spent on that. Another remarkable feature, too, was the laver. Now, later on, lavers were built. There was a laver built for the tabernacle to start with, and later on lavers were built, but not like Solomon's. It was cast out of bronze. It weighed 30 tons. This is the estimate. It weighed 30 tons. It was 17.5 feet in diameter, 30 feet in circumference, and it stood 15 feet high, and the metal was a hand's breadth in thickness. It was molded somehow, carved somehow by craftsmen, so that the lip of the laver formed something like the flower of a lily, and would hold 25,000 gallons of water. And that was made in connection with the first temple. And another little thing too, well, not so little, 2 cherubim were made of olive wood, first of all, and then overlaid with gold. And they were 15 feet high, taller than Bernard's Goliath. 15 feet high, with their wings outstretched. And they stood inside the Holy of Holies, and they were stationed so that the wing of one touched one wall, the other wing met the wing of his fellow, and the second one reached to touch the wall on the other side. So they really formed a kind of barrier inside the Holy of Holies itself, overlaid, 15 feet tall, overlaid with the finest gold. So you can see nothing was ever spared in the days of Solomon. And you can understand why, whenever the Jews thought about the restoration of the kingdom, they thought about the restoration of the glory and the majesty and the might and the wealth of Solomon's kingdom in its heyday. That was their conception of the kingdom. Now, the time is just about gone. A few questions or comments. Anybody? There's a lot more that could be said, but this is something you need to read for yourself. But you can see how well Solomon began, how promising the start was, well, you talk about being rich beyond the dreams of avarice. Well, there's the man. And if you read this in connection with Ecclesiastes, the wisdom, and you see what he built. I built houses and palaces and gardens, and how we tried to find satisfaction in all of these things, but found it to be vanity and vexation of spirit. You can understand the kind of man that Solomon was. Anybody anything? Edith? Well, as we pointed out once before, Solomon couldn't have been very old when he died, possibly 60, possibly 65. And it would seem to me that coming to the throne, perhaps at the age of 20, and God blessing him with wisdom, seems to me that the quality of those writings would require that they were done before his decline set in. So, when he was still a relatively young man. Because obviously, a man who gives himself over to the worship of idols, and a man who begins to impose upon his people to maintain his standard of living, to levy heavy taxes on them as he later did, certainly is not the kind of man to write the beautiful things that we have in these books. So it must have been in his heyday when he was relatively young. But there's no precise date that we can find, Edith. No?
Is there anything that indicates that God approved, for instance, of the making of these giant cherubim?
No, there's not. No. There's nothing at all. The cherubim feature not only in Israel's history, but even the history of ancient peoples like the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Solomon didn't think of the idea of cherubim. Right from the very beginning, you remember that God placed at the entrance to the garden cherubim with a flaming sword. So the cherubim had always been, in the minds of all of the people of the Middle East, representative or symbolic of the presence of God. Even when it comes to the making of the veils or curtains for the tabernacle, Moses was instructed that these should be made embroidered with cherubim, the figures of these heavenly beings embroidered in them, so that the cherubim always represented the presence of God to their minds. And apart from the carving of the cherubim with their wings outstretched over the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant was only about 45 inches long, and these two figures were made out of the solid piece of gold that formed the lid of that sacred box, with their wings arching over this solid piece of gold that was said to be the mercy seat. Now that is the only kind of cherubim that God commanded there to be carved. There's nothing in this record that I see that says that God told Solomon to make these 15 feet things, you know. But this was Solomon's own idea of worship, representing the... Isabel? Chapter. Chapter 6, verse 11. Yes. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon concerning this house which you are building. If you will walk in my statutes and obey my commandments and keep my commandments and walk in them, I will establish my word with you, which I spoke to David your father, and I will dwell among the children of Israel. This is this is Solomon's own idea. Let's say that the grand gesture that caused Solomon to sacrifice 1,000 animals at a time was the same magnanimous gesture that caused him to lavish so much gold and to make these things which seem to symbolize to him the spirit of worship. Sometimes you wonder if Solomon did this altogether for the glory of God, and not just a little bit for the glory of Solomon. This is true. And yet, you know, this is not the splendor that the Bible records, for he was wiser than all other men. His fame was in all the nations round about. He uttered 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish. All men came from all peoples to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. That's how the Bible commemorates him.
There was one who was willing to die in my stead, that a soul so unworthy might live. And the path to the cross he was willing to tread, all the sins of my life to forgive. They are nailed to the cross, they are nailed to the cross. Oh, how much he was willing to bear. With what anguish and loss Jesus went to the cross, but he carries my sins with him there. He is tender and loving and patient with me, while he cleanses my heart of its dross. But there's no condemnation, I know I am free, for my sins are all nailed to the cross. They are nailed to the cross, they are nailed to the cross. Oh, how much he was willing to bear. With what anguish and loss Jesus went to the cross, but he carries my sins with him there. I will cling to my Savior and never depart. I will joyfully journey each day, with a song on my lips and a song in my heart, that my sins have been taken away. They are nailed to the cross, they are nailed to the cross. Oh, how much he was willing to bear. With what anguish and loss Jesus went to the cross, but he carried my sins with him there. Days are filled with sorrow and care, hearts are lonely and drear. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Calvary, Calvary. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Cast your care on Jesus today, leave your worry and fear. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Calvary, Calvary. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Troubled soul the Savior can see, every heartache and tear. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Calvary, Calvary. Burdens are lifted at Calvary. Jesus is very near.